Hollywood has been lying to you for over 80 years. What if I told you that when the mighty American war machine first marched into battle in World War II, the most elite German generals didn't tremble? They laughed, they literally mocked the Americans in their private diaries, calling them amateurs playing dress-up with shiny new toys. But here's the massive secret the history books left out. There was one group of Allied soldiers, a rugged, underestimated band of men that the British High Command treated like absolute garbage. Yet when the battle-hardened veterans of the Nazi Afrika Korps realized these men were waiting for them in the desert, their laughter died, and it was replaced by pure, paralyzing terror. Why were Hitler's most decorated panzer commanders suddenly begging, literally begging, to be transferred away from the front lines? What horrifying, ruthless tactics did these __0__soldiers use in the dead of night that made German officers write that they were fighting actual demons? Today, we are tearing open the classified, blood-stained German war diaries that were never supposed to see the light of day. We are exposing a shocking, censored truth that completely shatters the Hollywood myth of World War II. You need to watch every single second of this video because the chilling revelation buried at the very end of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's personal journal will leave you absolutely speechless. You won't believe what these men did in the dark. Let's dig into the truth. In the suffocating heat of February 1943, the most elite German generals watched a catastrophic collapse unfold through their field binoculars and burst into cruel, mocking laughter. The mighty American army, hyped as the ultimate savior of the free world, was fleeing through the Tunisian desert in a state of absolute humiliating panic. Hundreds of burning vehicles littered the Kasserine Pass, painting the blazing sky with thick pillars of oily black smoke while abandoning perfectly good equipment to the advancing enemy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel recorded this chaotic retreat in his private diaries with supreme arrogance, noting that these wealthy boys were simply playing dress-up in a real war, but those very same battle-hardened Nazi veterans were hiding a chilling, humiliating secret about another Allied force they had encountered exactly 2 years earlier, a secret so dark it would rewrite history. To understand why the greatest military machine in modern history was paralyzed by an unspoken terror, we must first look at the blinding contrast between two completely different breeds of men. When the United States military arrived on the scorching shores of North Africa in late 1942, they brought a staggering wave of absolute material perfection. These soldiers stepped off their massive transport ships carrying brand new rifles, wearing spotless new uniforms, and marching in heavy new boots that had never tasted the bitter flavor of trench mud. The air around their sprawling camps smelled of fresh canvas, expensive weapons grease, and endless mountains of rich rations that made their impoverished allies weep with raw envy. Yet beneath this shiny, indestructible armor of wealth lay a terrifying vulnerability that no amount of taxpayer money could ever mask. The one critical element these golden boys of democracy lacked was the brutal, irreversible baptism of authentic combat. They possessed the finest communication radios and the heaviest field artillery on the planet, but their minds had never been fractured by the apocalyptic roar of an incoming barrage. The unforgiving desert simply does not care about your logistical superiority when the sky begins to rain molten steel and the ground trembles with the approach of hostile armor. These eager troops had not yet learned how to anchor their feet to the soil when every single screaming instinct inside their bodies demands that they drop their weapons and run for the hills. This fatal absence of psychological conditioning would soon exact a terrifying toll on their ranks, leading to a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. But they had absolutely no idea that the true nightmare was only just beginning to cast its suffocating shadow over the blood-stained sands. Long before these well-equipped reinforcements even dreamed of crossing the treacherous ocean, the desolate wastelands of the Middle East had already swallowed a completely different kind of Allied force. The Australian divisions that deployed to this godforsaken theater more than 2 years earlier possessed absolutely none of that naive, untested innocence. These rugged men from the harsh outback had already lost their illusions, trading them for a dark, cynical resilience forged in the absolute worst conditions imaginable. They had been thoroughly broken by the unforgiving environment and rebuilt into something entirely unrecognizable to the polished, wealthy officers of the old world. British High Command frequently looked upon these sunburned, insubordinate warriors with barely concealed disgust, utterly failing to comprehend the incredibly dangerous weapon they held in their bare hands. The Australians operated with a chilling, predatory calmness, stripping away all the useless pageantry of traditional military doctrine in favor of pure, ruthless survival. They did not care about perfectly creased trousers, polished buttons, or snappy salutes, focusing entirely on the brutal mechanics of outlasting an enemy that wanted to erase them from existence. By the time they found themselves staring into the merciless eyes of the German war machine, their psychological armor was infinitely thicker than any heavy tank plating. The arrogant Nazis would soon discover that attempting to intimidate these hardened veterans was the most catastrophic miscalculation of their entire continental campaign. This shocking realization was merely the calm before a storm that would violently shatter the foundational myths of the entire global conflict. In the blazing spring of 1941, the seemingly invincible Afrika Korps swept across the North African coastline like an apocalyptic, unstoppable plague. General Rommel had earned his terrifying reputation by moving faster than his panicked enemies could even process, turning orderly, strategic withdrawals into chaotic, humiliating routs. The British Imperial forces were collapsing at an astonishing rate, leaving behind a miserable trail of abandoned outposts and a desperate stench of total strategic failure. The German High Command was practically intoxicated by their own lightning-fast triumphs, firmly believing that absolutely nothing on this earth could halt their mechanized march to ultimate victory. Only one fragile, heavily battered obstacle remained between this ruthless juggernaut and the total domination of the vital coastal supply routes. The isolated port town of Tobruk sat on the ragged edge of the Mediterranean Sea, a miserable stretch of sun-baked rock and blinding sand that looked like the very definition of a hopeless last stand. The panic within the British leadership had reached such a fever pitch that senior generals hiding in secure bunkers hundreds of miles away seriously debated abandoning the position altogether. They nervously looked at the terrifying intelligence reports, calculated the overwhelming odds, and coldly prepared to write off the entire garrison as an acceptable, albeit tragic, strategic loss. The situation seemed so irrevocably doomed that even the most optimistic military planners fully expected the town to fall within a matter of 48 hours. They severely underestimated the men actually standing in those shallow, crumbling trenches who had absolutely no intention of participating in this scheduled surrender. Exactly 33,000 Australian soldiers found themselves completely cut off from the rest of the civilized world, surrounded by hostile territory, and relying entirely on the dangerous midnight runs of naval destroyers for their daily survival. Instead of succumbing to the crushing psychological weight of their isolation, they simply gripped their battered Lee Enfield rifles tighter and absolutely refused to yield a single inch of ground. They completely ignored the panicked whispers of the British command and began carving a 50-kilometer perimeter of pure defiance directly into the unforgiving bedrock. They were effectively declaring a personal, vicious war against an empire that had just brought all of Western Europe to its trembling knees. They still did not know that a monumental, soul-crushing complication was rushing toward them through the suffocating desert dust. The combined force that General Rommel brought to the battered gates of Tobruk was a terrifying, mechanized behemoth numbering over 100,000 elite German and Italian troops. The deafening, mechanical roar of hundreds of approaching panzers physically shook the ground, while the air filled with the suffocating stench of burning diesel exhaust and pulverized limestone. Against the modest array of captured weapons and improvised, shallow defenses held by the trapped Australians, this massive concentration of firepower looked like an execution squad preparing to obliterate a cornered animal. The German commanders eagerly checked their heavy pocket watches, supremely confident that this minor irritation would be wiped from the map before the blazing sun reached its zenith. The immense emotional pendulum of battle was about to swing in a direction that would leave the highest ranks of the Nazi Party in a state of absolute uncomprehending shock. When the first massive wave of German armor and infantry slammed into the fragile perimeter, they fully expected the defenders to break and flee in the face of certain obliteration. Instead, they were met by a devastating, meticulously coordinated wall of explosive fury that instantly turned their proud assault into a chaotic, screaming slaughterhouse. The defiant Australians absorbed the punishing blow without taking a single step backward, unleashing a ferocious counter-barrage that left the burning, twisted wrecks of German tanks scattered across the barren desert floor. In a matter of agonizing hours, the arrogant illusion of Rommel's unstoppable blitzkrieg was violently, irreversibly shattered against a solid wall of pure Australian stubbornness. But the true paralyzing horror for the besieging army was only just taking shape in the long, creeping shadows of the Libyan dusk. The failed daytime assaults were merely the opening act of a psychological torment that would soon drive elite Nazi stormtroopers to the absolute brink of total insanity. While the exhausted Germans tried to recover in their heavily fortified camps, they mistakenly assumed that the heavily outnumbered garrison would simply cower in their trenches and pray for divine deliverance. They completely failed to realize that the moment the scorching sun dipped below the horizon, the rules of the savage contest would be completely rewritten by the ruthless defenders. The arrogant hunters who had mercilessly terrorized the entire European continent were about to become the helpless, trembling prey in a terrifying nocturnal game they could not possibly survive. This was the exact moment when the confident smirks of the Axis commanders morphed into a permanent, horrifying grimace of pure dread. The vast numerical superiority of 100,000 troops meant absolutely nothing when facing an adversary that completely refused to play by the established rules of civilized warfare. The blazing heat of the day gave way to the freezing desert night, bringing with it a sinister silence that was infinitely more terrifying than the loudest artillery barrage. Those 33,000 stubborn ghosts from the outback had transformed a desperate defensive siege into a brutal, aggressive hunt that would forever stain the pristine diaries of the German High Command. The full truth of what happened in that blinding darkness is a shocking revelation that military historians have tried to sanitize for decades, and we are finally about to expose every single horrifying detail. Imagine an elite armored commander, a heavily decorated veteran who had marched triumphantly through the burning ruins of Western Europe, suddenly weeping uncontrollably in his fortified bunker while begging his superiors for an immediate transfer. The air inside his subterranean shelter reeked of stale sweat, spilled diesel fuel, and the metallic tang of pure, unadulterated panic that had completely infected his once proud battalion. And these hardened men were not broken by massive aerial bombardments or overwhelming artillery fire, but by a phantom menace that turned the simple, necessary act of closing their exhausted eyes into a guarantee of a fatal outcome. To understand what shattered the minds of these arrogant conquerors, we must venture deep into the pitch-black wasteland where a completely new, terrifying breed of psychological warfare was being born. When the blinding desert sun finally dipped below the jagged horizon, the battered German soldiers foolishly believed they could finally catch their breath and find temporary sanctuary in their deep trenches. The scorching heat rapidly gave way to a freezing, suffocating darkness, bringing a deceptive silence that masked the truly sinister preparations happening just a few hundred yards away behind the Allied barbed wire. The Australian defenders absolutely refused to play the traditional cowardly role of a passive garrison waiting meekly for the next morning assault to inevitably crush them into the endless dust. Instead, they actively transformed the desolate, mine-filled stretch of no man's land into their own personal, highly lethal hunting ground, rewriting the established rules of combat with cold-blooded precision. But the arrogant invaders had absolutely no idea that the suffocating darkness was about to swallow their bravest men without leaving a single trace behind. Every single night, Beneath a canopy of cold and indifferent stars, small packs of Australian soldiers numbering between 6 and 30 men slipped silently over their defensive perimeters and vanished into the dense shadows. They deliberately stripped off their clunky military gear, smeared their faces with thick layers of burnt cork, and crawled on their bellies through the treacherous rocks with the chilling patience of apex predators. They carried absolutely no heavy machine guns or noisy equipment, arming themselves only with razor-sharp combat knives and long, gleaming bayonets that caught absolutely no reflection in the pitch-black environment. The oppressive silence of the desert became their ultimate devastating weapon, allowing them to effortlessly bypass sophisticated early warning systems and appear directly inside the enemy strongholds like avenging phantoms. The sheer unpredictability of these aggressive night raids completely destroyed the fragile nervous systems of the German forces, leaving them trapped in a constant, paralyzing state of maximum alert. Nobody in the Axis camp knew which specific patch of darkness concealed a crawling squad of hardened outback veterans ready to deliver a swift and silent tragedy before disappearing back into the void. Terrified German sentries began firing their weapons blindly at every shifting shadow and every whispering gust of wind, desperately wasting valuable ammunition on empty air while the real, breathing danger circled them from behind. The agonizing strain of severe sleep deprivation and relentless psychological torment began inflicting far more devastating damage on the elite infantry divisions than the heaviest Allied artillery barrages ever could. They foolishly believed the situation could not possibly deteriorate further, completely unaware that a horrifying revelation was already being documented in the private journals of their own terrified comrades. The classified, hastily scribbled diaries of the German infantrymen reveal a level of raw, unfiltered panic that mainstream history books have deliberately tried to hide from the global public for over 80 years. A captured journal belonging to a seasoned corporal in the 94th Infantry Division detailed the paralyzing dread that instantly infected his entire unit when they learned fresh Australian troops had occupied the opposite sector. He wrote with trembling hands that absolutely nobody dared to speak out loud, but every single man knew with absolute certainty that the invisible hunters would come for them the moment the light faded from the sky. His chilling, desperate premonition proved absolutely correct, as the very next morning, 3 empty cots stood as a silent, horrifying testament to the soldiers who simply vanished into the terrifying night. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary tactical genius who had previously treated the entire British military establishment with absolute contempt, watched his invincible forces crumble under this invisible, crushing weight. His exhausted officers were forced to constantly rotate battered divisions away from the front lines, frantically trying to prevent a total collapse of morale among elite stormtroopers who were now literally afraid of the dark. The hunters who had mercilessly terrorized the entire European continent had definitively become the helpless, trembling prey in a terrifying nocturnal game they could not possibly win. This total reversal of the psychological power dynamic firmly established a permanent aura of dread around the Australian formations that would haunt the German high command until the very end of the global conflict. Yet, just as the terrified Axis troops thought they understood the grim rules of this nocturnal horror, the situation plunged into a completely new dimension of absolute rule-breaking madness. While the Germans were slowly losing their minds in the dark, a completely different, equally sinister crisis was quietly threatening to doom the stubborn Australian defenders once and for all. The suffocating, unrelenting siege had completely severed their primary maritime supply lines, leaving the isolated garrison with critically low reserves of standard ammunition and essential combat gear. Traditional military doctrine explicitly states that an army without proper supplies must inevitably raise the white flag, and the German logistics officers smugly calculated the exact day the Allied resistance would simply run dry. They confidently waited for the inevitable surrender, completely failing to anticipate the shocking, rule-breaking ingenuity of men who had spent their entire lives solving impossible problems in the harshest environments on Earth. These rugged rural shearers, farmers, and tough bush mechanics looked at their rapidly emptying ammunition crates and simply refused to accept the miserable fate that the polite British generals had predicted for them. When the official shipments of standard explosive devices completely dried up, the Australian engineers immediately transformed their dusty underground bunkers into a chaotic, highly efficient weapons factory. They scavenged empty food containers, ripped dangerous detonators from unexploded enemy shells with their bare hands, and packed them tight with salvaged explosive powder to create an improvised nightmare. These crude, terrifying contraptions became legendary on the burning battlefield, universally known as jam tin bombs, because they were literally constructed from the discarded remnants of their daily breakfast rations. They celebrated this dirty, mechanical triumph, entirely unaware that their makeshift arsenal was about to inflict a devastating psychological blow on the highest ranks of the German command. The sudden, explosive appearance of these ugly, devastatingly effective homemade weapons sent massive shockwaves of confusion and profound despair through the rigid, highly disciplined ranks of the German military. When a perfectly engineered panzer division is suddenly halted by defiant men throwing exploding marmalade cans, it violently shatters the fundamental illusion of technological superiority that fueled the entire Axis war machine. The German troops found these crude, unpredictable weapons deeply unsettling, not because they were technologically advanced, but because their very existence proved that the enemy would literally never stop fighting regardless of the circumstances. It was a terrifying, gut-wrenching realization that no amount of naval blockades or strategic starvation could ever extinguish the burning, ferocious will of these relentless defenders. But the shocking resourcefulness of the Australian troops was rapidly escalating into a direct, humiliating insult that would drive the enemy strategists into fits of blind, uncontrollable rage. Unlike the proper, well-mannered Allied units who politely treated captured enemy equipment as useless trophies to be sent back to headquarters, the pragmatic diggers viewed every fallen opponent as a highly convenient supply drop. They eagerly stripped the contested battlefields bare, meticulously cleaning captured German rifles, happily test-firing abandoned submachine guns, and instantly turning the enemy's own terrifying firepower directly back against them. They possessed absolutely no respect for the sacred, unwritten rules of civilized war, happily consuming captured German food rations while wearing pieces of enemy uniforms to replace their own rotting gear. This blatant, systematic theft felt like a brilliant tactical victory, but it triggered a ferocious, desperate backlash from an enemy that was rapidly running out of rational options. This relentless, highly organized scavenging operation completely derailed the entire Axis strategy because it meant the heavily besieged garrison was actively feeding and arming itself from the very army trying to destroy it. German logistics officers were driven to absolute distraction, tearing their hair out as they realized their own massive, expensive supply convoys were effectively keeping the stubborn Australian resistance fully operational. Every single bullet fired at the defenders only provided them with more raw materials to forge new, improvised instruments of absolute chaos in their subterranean workshops. The meticulous, calculated siege that was supposed to neatly wrap up the North African campaign had mutated into a sprawling, uncontrollable nightmare that defied every known law of physics and conventional combat. You can practically smell the boiling frustration radiating from the official German dispatches of that period, as highly educated strategists failed to comprehend how a gang of scavengers was winning the brutal war of attrition. Official company commanders actually began filing deeply humiliating reports, formally begging their superiors to reposition their units away from the sectors known to be held by the unpredictable Australian troops. They openly admitted that their highly trained infantrymen were no longer mentally capable of holding the line against these resourceful phantoms, warning that the combat value of their entire force was rapidly evaporating. General Rommel forcefully denied these desperate requests because he lacked the necessary reserves, forcing his terrified men to remain trapped in a relentless meat grinder entirely of the Australians' making. Deep inside a stifling, dimly lit interrogation bunker beneath the scorching African sand, a highly trained German intelligence officer experienced a complete, humiliating professional breakdown. He was an absolute, undisputed master of psychological manipulation, fully accustomed to breaking the fragile spirits of captured European soldiers within a matter of hours using sophisticated threats and agonizing isolation. But the heavily bruised, thoroughly exhausted Australian prisoner sitting shackled across the metal table was currently doing the absolute unthinkable. He was laughing directly in his frustrated captor's face. The harsh, blinding glare of the bare light bulb illuminated a rugged man who simply did not care about the terrifying, world-conquering reputation of the mighty German Empire. How could an unstoppable military machine that had just conquered entire sophisticated nations fail to extract a single piece of useful tactical intelligence from a ragged, starving captive? But the baffling, infuriating secret behind this unbreakable mental armor was buried far away from the desolate desert, forged in the most unforgiving, hostile environments on the entire planet. To truly understand this infuriating defiance, the baffled German strategists had to look far beyond their pristine military training manuals and examine the brutal, unforgiving civilian lives of these extraordinary men. These stubborn soldiers were absolutely not career military professionals who had been carefully groomed in comfortable aristocratic European academies, but incredibly tough rural laborers who viewed physical suffering as a completely normal baseline condition. They were calloused sheep shearers, deep shaft coal miners, isolated timber workers, and rugged cattlemen who had spent their entire earthly existence surviving in an absolutely merciless, sun-scorched outback. Working relentlessly in extreme heat, totally isolated from reliable medical support and modern comforts, had naturally conditioned their bodies and minds to endure levels of agonizing hardship that would easily break a city-dwelling recruit. When these rugged outback survivors were forcefully dragged into the terrifying German interrogation rooms, they completely shattered every established sacred rule of military captivity and psychological warfare. Instead of showing the expected trembling anxiety about their grim future, they cheerfully complained about the miserable, tasteless quality of the Axis food rations and openly mocked the sheer incompetence of their own British commanding officers. The sophisticated psychological toolkit of the German intelligence branch, meticulously designed to exploit deep shame, crushing loneliness, and hopeless despair, proved completely and utterly useless. These rugged captives possessed a profound, radical indifference to formal authority, creating an impenetrable psychological shield that absolutely infuriated the elite Nazi high command who demanded total submission. The only thing that could ever provoke a genuine emotional response from these hardened prisoners was a fierce, uncompromising dedication to the sacred, unspoken brotherhood they called mateship. They completely ignored patriotic speeches about defending the glorious British crown, focusing their entire existence on ensuring the physical survival of the ordinary guy suffering in the adjacent cramped cell. If an Allied commander ordered a strategic retreat while a wounded comrade was left bleeding in the scorching dust, these fiercely loyal men would instantly commit absolute insubordination without a second thought. This pure, unbreakable devotion meant that you could not simply demoralize an Australian unit by cutting off their leadership. You had to physically dismantle them man by man until absolutely no one was left standing. They falsely believed this stubborn, rule-breaking defiance was a unique anomaly confined to the African desert, completely unaware that another mighty empire was about to experience the exact same terrifying phenomenon. 12,000 kilometers away from the burning sands of Libya, a completely different, infinitely more suffocating nightmare was rapidly unfolding beneath the dense, rotting canopy of the Pacific jungle. By the brutal summer of 1942, the seemingly unstoppable Imperial Japanese Army was sweeping aggressively southward, leaving a massive, terrifying trail of catastrophic Allied defeats in their bloody wake. They were universally feared and respected as the undisputed masters of aggressive jungle warfare, fully accustomed to effortlessly encircling and completely dismantling heavily armed colonial garrisons across Southeast Asia. As they began their treacherous, highly confident march down the narrow, muddy nightmare known to the world as the Kokoda Track in New Guinea, they fully expected the defending forces to rapidly collapse under the unbearable pressure. The air in these prehistoric towering mountains was a toxic, rotting soup of intense humidity, constantly carrying the suffocating stench of decaying vegetation and rampant, debilitating malaria. The exhausted Australian troops desperately blocking their aggressive path were initially dismissed by the Imperial conquerors as poorly trained, miserable militia units, derisively labeled as chocolate soldiers who would instantly melt under the intense heat of a real battle. The arrogant Japanese commanders eagerly prepared for another incredibly swift, glorious triumph, completely ignoring the sinister mounting warning signs that their aggressive advance was about to slam into a devastating, immovable brick wall. They foolishly assumed that European-descended troops could absolutely never match their legendary endurance in an incredibly hostile environment that seemed perfectly designed to swallow weak men whole. But the dark, humid shadows of the dense rainforest were about to teach the Emperor's elite forces the exact same brutal lesson that had humiliated General Rommel in the scorching desert. When the massive, overwhelming Japanese offensive finally crashed into the fragile Australian defensive lines, the arrogant invaders experienced a sudden, paralyzing shock that severely damaged their supreme institutional pride. Instead of crumbling into a disorganized, cowardly panic under the terrifying threat of total encirclement, the fiercely stubborn defenders launched savage, relentless counterattacks that completely defied all rational tactical logic. They instantly adapted to the brutal jungle environment with a terrifying predatory instinct, utilizing brilliant invisible ambush tactics that rapidly turned the claustrophobic mountain passes into absolute scenes of ultimate tragedy. The Australian soldiers fought with an explosive, desperate ferocity, making the supposedly invincible Imperial veterans pay a horrific, agonizing price for every single miserable meter of thick, suffocating mud they managed to capture. The absolute mind-numbing shock of this violent encounter was later documented in the highly classified operational histories of the Japanese 17th Army, revealing a stunning level of professional respect bordering on sheer terror. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, an elite imperial officer famous for his extreme intellectual arrogance and total, undisguised contempt for Western militaries, made a stunning, completely unprecedented admission regarding the brutal jungle campaign. He officially wrote in his secret reports that the Australian infantrymen were unlike any other Allied troops they had previously engaged, showcasing a highly sophisticated mastery of stealth that deeply unsettled the Imperial command. Coming from the absolute highest echelons of an army that systematically underestimated every single opponent on the globe, this was a breathtaking, incredibly rare acknowledgement of a truly terrifying adversary. And this chilling, legendary reputation was not just recognized by their sworn terrified enemies, because their closest allies were secretly writing incredibly revealing reports behind completely closed doors. By the late autumn of 1942, the High Command of the United States military was desperately trying to analyze and rebuild its own forces after witnessing several humiliating, tragic combat setbacks. American intelligence officers were quietly dispatched to closely observe the rugged Commonwealth formations, originally carrying a deep-seated institutional bias that viewed these Allied units as completely outdated secondary forces. But when these highly critical observers actually witnessed the Australian infantry operating in the suffocatingly close, dangerous terrain of New Guinea, their dismissive prejudice instantly evaporated into a state of profound, absolute awe. They watched with wide, disbelieving eyes as these ragged, completely exhausted men repeatedly demonstrated a spectacular level of individual initiative and ruthless adaptability that was entirely unmatched by any other force in the global conflict. In a highly classified, heavily guarded intelligence assessment report, one seasoned American major firmly stated that absolutely no American infantry unit currently operating in the theater could possibly match the routine daily effectiveness of the Australian formations. These were definitely not the poetic, exaggerated words of a romantic storyteller or a biased politician. They were the cold, precise judgments of professional military analysts desperately seeking a way to win a devastating global struggle. The overwhelming converging evidence from elite German diaries, secret Japanese operational histories, and classified American intelligence reports painted an undeniable, universally terrifying picture that history simply cannot erase. The absolute mastery of the cruelest battlefields belonged exclusively to these unpolished, insubordinate men from the outback, who proved beyond any reasonable doubt that a relentless human spirit is infinitely more dangerous than the most expensive military machine ever built. Deep within the heavily guarded, climate-controlled vaults of modern military archives, an explosive, world-altering truth lies quietly hidden beneath thick layers of yellowed, crumbling paper. If you lean in close enough to these restricted glass display cases, you can almost smell the suffocating metallic dust of the Libyan desert and the rotting, deeply infectious tang of Pacific jungle mud radiating from the pages. These are absolutely not the polished, heavily sanitized propaganda scripts designed by desperate politicians in safe capital cities to artificially boost the fragile morale of a weeping, terrified nation. Instead, they are the frantic, blood-stained confessions of the most ruthless, efficient conquerors the 20th century had ever produced, hastily scribbled in the pitch-black trenches by visibly trembling hands. The undeniable, shocking reality captured in these frantic pages completely demolishes decades of carefully constructed Hollywood myths, leaving behind a raw, unfiltered testament to a terrifying breed of warrior that the world will never see again. But the most shocking, paradigm-shifting revelation hidden within these fragile pages goes far beyond simple battlefield statistics, striking directly at the very core of human psychology and survival. The arrogant military academies of the old European empires had spent centuries falsely preaching that superior technology, massive supply chains, and unquestioning blind obedience were the only true keys to absolute global domination. But the ragged, fiercely independent men from the scorching Australian outback violently tore that pristine aristocratic theory to absolute shreds, using nothing but pure, unadulterated raw willpower and sheer mechanical ingenuity. Their ultimate invincible weapon was never a newly issued rifle, a heavy artillery piece, or a massive column of armored vehicles, but a dark, unbreakable psychological bond that the elite Axis commanders could not even begin to comprehend. They fought with a terrifying, almost supernatural intensity, not for the abstract glory of a distant British king, but simply to prevent an irreversible tragedy from claiming the exhausted, bleeding mate standing right beside them. This raw, primal devotion transformed ordinary farmhands, gritty miners, and quiet shearers into an unstoppable force of nature that completely shattered the most advanced, heavily funded military machines on the face of the earth. When the blazing, unforgiving sky rained liquid fire and the jagged earth violently erupted all around their incredibly shallow trenches, these men absolutely did not cower or beg for a miraculous deliverance. They possessed a chilling, almost unnatural willingness to eagerly embrace the ultimate final curtain if it meant buying just one more precious minute of physical survival for their fiercely loyal brothers in arms. A polished, highly educated Allied general might instantly order a strategic retreat to preserve his own immaculate career, but an Australian digger would stubbornly hold his crumbling, desperate position until his physical body could literally no longer function. This absolute, terrifying refusal to abandon a fallen comrade created an impenetrable wall of human defiance that completely neutralized the sophisticated, highly coordinated blitzkrieg tactics of the supposedly invincible enemy forces. It was a brutal, uncompromising philosophy that turned every single dusty trench and muddy, flooded crater into a devastating, permanent monument of unbreakable human spirit that absolutely terrified the Axis High Command. The sheer psychological weight of this unbreakable brotherhood created a terrifying ripple effect that completely shattered the morale of anyone foolish enough to stand in their aggressive way. Imagine being an elite Axis stormtrooper, thoroughly indoctrinated by years of aggressive political conditioning, only to realize your supposedly superior ideology is entirely powerless against a group of stubborn men fighting only for each other. The massive Nazi propaganda machine desperately tried to hide these catastrophic tactical failures from their own civilian population, burying the terrifying field reports in heavily classified subterranean vaults deep beneath the German capital. But the deeply traumatized survivors of those relentless desert nights and brutal jungle skirmishes carried the haunting, unforgettable memories back to their shattered homes, whispering about an enemy that defied all human logic. They spread dark, chilling tales of the relentless outback phantoms that no amount of official government censorship or strict military discipline could ever hope to suppress or erase from the collective conscience. The myth of absolute Axis invincibility was being systematically dismantled by men who wore slouch hats, completely ignoring traditional military protocols while delivering absolute catastrophe to their sophisticated foes. Yet, to fully grasp the colossal historical magnitude of this terrifying reputation, we must forcefully return to that blinding North African desert where our incredible, blood-soaked journey first began. Cast your mind back to the chaotic, smoke-filled ruins of the Kasserine Pass in the early months of 1943, where the wealthy, highly inexperienced American forces faced their very first catastrophic trial. The elite German generals had stared through their precision optical binoculars at the panicked, disorganized retreat of the world's richest army and erupted into fits of arrogant, highly mocking laughter. They gleefully filled their private leather-bound journals with sneering, condescending insults, dismissing the shiny new American war machine as an absolute monumental joke played by terrified amateurs in pristine, freshly pressed uniforms. That cruel, echoing laughter perfectly defined the initial humiliating clash of expanding empires, illustrating the supreme, unshakable confidence of a Nazi high command that firmly believed itself to be completely and utterly invincible. But you will search those exact same dusty classified German diaries for 1,000 years and never find a single solitary syllable of laughter directed at the ragged men from the distant southern hemisphere. When the grim subject suddenly turned to the fierce Australian divisions who had haunted their darkest nights and violently stolen their heavily guarded supplies, the arrogant ink of the Nazi officers instantly turned cold and completely devoid of humor. Their arrogant, booming chuckles were rapidly replaced by a creeping, paralyzing dread, meticulously documenting a level of profound professional respect that bordered on pure, unfiltered, animalistic panic. The boastful, heavily decorated conquerors of the European continent were forcefully made to swallow their immense pride and officially admit that they had finally encountered a unique breed of men completely immune to their terrifying psychological tactics. And while the German Empire was permanently paralyzed by this nocturnal terror, the most fanatical warriors of the Pacific Theater were simultaneously forging a legendary title that would echo through eternity. The Imperial Japanese Army, a radically fanatical, incredibly brutal force that genuinely viewed tactical surrender as the ultimate unforgivable disgrace, possessed 100 different derogatory nicknames for the various Allied forces they gleefully crushed. They continuously mocked the rapidly retreating colonial garrisons and confidently brushed aside heavily armed European defenders as if they were nothing more than bothersome, insignificant insects blocking their glorious path to total continental victory. But when it came to the savage, mud-soaked Australian infantrymen holding the agonizing, claustrophobic mountain passes of New Guinea, the harsh imperial translation suddenly lost absolutely all of its customary overbearing arrogance. They definitively did not call them cowards, they absolutely did not call them weak amateurs, and they most certainly did not dare to laugh at their unconventional, incredibly brutal methods of close-quarters jungle warfare. In the chaotic, blood-soaked dialects of the Imperial Command, the ultimate title bestowed upon these relentless outback warriors carried a chilling, unforgettable weight of absolute, terrifying finality. Stripped of all elaborate military jargon, political posturing, and romanticized Allied propaganda, the Japanese name for the Australian soldier translated into something incredibly simple, yet profoundly disturbing to any opposing global force. They were simply known in the hushed, deeply terrified whispers of the surviving enemy veterans as the ones who absolutely never stopped fighting regardless of the horrifying odds stacked against them. And as the suffocating smoke of the greatest conflict in human history finally cleared, that single haunting phrase remained permanently etched in the secret diaries of two fallen empires, proving forever that the sheer unbreakable grit of a loyal mate will always outlast the most terrifying armies the world could ever possibly assemble.